Moving on, we're going to move on to an Eldar construct next. We're going to move on to the Wraith Lord. Now, Wraith Lords are essentially the Eldar equivalent of Dreadnoughts. Again, like the Dreadnought, they're not actually piloted, but in Wraith Lord's case, a Spirit Stone, which has the soul of a deceased Eldar, is implanted within the Wraith Lord. However, unlike the Dreadnought, it does not equate to instant reaction time. Because the soul is, in fact, inhabiting the realm of the dead and the realm of the living at the same time, it's very slow to react and needs an actual Spirit Seer in close proximity to operate to full functionality. Now, standard Wraith Lord equipment includes 2 power fists with flamers or shuriken cannons, but in addition, Wraith Lords can be equipped with heavy armaments such as scatter lasers, missile launchers, bright lances, and star cannons. And Wraith Lords can also be armed with things such as ghost glaives as well, in the Wraith Seer variant, which hold the souls of Eldar Warlocks or Farseers.
So, this is a fairly decent design. Now, I will say the control mechanism for it is half-assed backwards. Because what you're basically telling me is that, first off, someone basically had to die in order for this thing to have a pilot. And then on top of that, you have to have someone supporting them in order for that pilot to be functional. Not the greatest concept. Kinda seems counterproductive. Because that means that you have this huge machine you've designed that's made entirely of Wraithbone, which my understanding of is a pretty rare substance for Eldar these days. And now you're telling me that it has to be operated by both a soul that you've implanted in it and by a Spirit Seer or Warlock outside of it.
Essentially, it's like a gigantic RC car.
Yeah. It's a gigantic, slightly intelligent RC car. Which means that this thing could be really effective if the design design of how it was controlled was, taken into account as something majorly useful. Moving on from there, it's completely covered from head to toe in armor plating that's actually thicker than what goes on the Eldar tanks.
Again, proving the point that the Eldar, they know how to design walkers, they just don't know how to do bloody tanks.
Exactly! The thinnest point of armor on this is actually still thicker than the Eldar super tanks. So the thickest point on the Eldar super tanks with the big massive twin cannon turrets is still thinner than this thing's thinnest point of armor on its center torso.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the thickest point of armor on Eldar's super heavy tank only 15mm?
It's only 15mm, and when I measured this, played with the model, and actually looked at the specs, the thinnest point on this thing is 23mm. They are protecting their dead better than their living.
Quite.
Now, weaponry-wise, again, as flexible as a Dreadnought in terms of weapons, and the Ghost Glaive is a very nice addition. It gives it a lot of reach in melee, while still being allowed to maintain a decent amount of firepower at range. And as I noticed with the Dreadnought having extra space for weapons in certain places, the Eldar seem to have taken advantage for this, because just about every one of them I see has shoulder-mounted weaponry. Which means that, yeah, they took advantage of mounting weapons on the torso. And that shoulder-mounted weaponry ranges from simple shuriken cannons that are equivalent to the same shuriken rifles that their infantry use, to as big as a bright lance, or even, I hate to say it, I saw somebody mounting a fire prism on one of them.
Oh dear God.
In addition to carrying its Ghostglaive sword, which is the equivalent of a power sword, just really freaking huge. And with the strength that this thing has the potential to swing at, assuming you have a Spirit Seer or a Warlocks or a Farseer supporting it, the strength it can pack behind that sword could potentially cut through a dreadnought.
I just want to point out, because I actually forgot to mention it in the Dreadnought entry, Space Wolf Dreadnoughts have actually been known to carry gigantic battle axes and shields, which could make combat between one of these things quite interesting.
Not only have they been known to carry giant shields and axes, they have been known to have their Power Claw retrofitted into a Lightning Claw. A Dreadnought-sized Lightning Claw. I think Wolverine would be envious of that one. But yeah, the walkers are very well designed. Just, I have some really comeuppance with the control mechanism, in that you have a very, very vulnerable Starseer, a Spirit Seer, or Warlock, or Farseer sitting outside of this thing to keep it operating at full capacity. And I think that if you wanted to do that, you should probably have made room to put them inside of what effectively looks like your most heavily armored unit you're going to deploy onto the battlefield for the most part.
Now, before we move on, can I just say, is it still better than a Dread Knight?
A Dread Knight? Yes. It is much better than the baby carrier.
I was going to say, were you suggesting that we have an Eldar version of this, basically a Wraith Lord baby carrying a Farseer?
At least the guy who has to help operate and control this can choose to do so from a point of cover, a vantage point, or actually using the machine as a giant distraction so nobody shoots at him. The Dread Knight can't do that. But yeah, that is one advantage to this thing, is that while I am criticizing them for not putting the guy who's helping it function at full capacity into some form of protective area, he is still he can act independently of the machine, whereas with a Dread Knight, not only are you not protected, but you're not independent of it.
So next up on the list, then, we have the Eldar Wasp. Now, in our Eldar episode, we mentioned the War Walkers. These things are War Walkers with jump packs, essentially.
Okay. I was aware of the jump pack. I am going to say this in comparison to the War Walker. The Wasp has better coverage for the pilot. Even if it is a completely see-through transparent material, it still has significantly better coverage above and to his left and right sides than the War Walker. There is less chance that somebody is going to get beside this thing and put a bolt around directly into the driver than with the War Walker.
And if someone did get close enough, they could use a jump back to essentially jump out the way.
Very much so. However, its primary protection is still a transparent material, which is going to inherently be significantly weaker than actual plating, which I can kind of understand that you want them to have the field of view, but if the Eldar are as psychic as everyone claims them to be, and all these other capabilities, I question again the use of transparent materials for cockpits, when you could just put a steel plate over it and then give them a psychic amp so they could see outside and around them in a way that would not be normally even possible. Or some sensors or something of that nature where they don't have to be completely exposed and with a giant area that says, please shoot me with a crack missile. Other than that, it's a War Walker. It's a slightly better armored, much more mobile War Walker. It doesn't have any features that really seem to scream out at me as unique or super effective, and I'm kind of a little disappointed that it doesn't mount more weaponry for what it is. You have two side-mounted weapons on all of these on the shoulders, but you have the potential for, say, a chin turret, or I know I'm sounding a little bit like an orc here, but I'm also a person who regularly designed BattleTech mechs for people, and there's the potential here for a chin turret, there's a potential here for a center torso-mounted weapon, there's the potential to actually cover the driver of this thing completely up on all sides, and mount weapons beside him, instead of just on the shoulders, but it is what it is, and to me it just... Each of these is too specialized and doesn't pack enough punch.
Speaking of orcs, next up we have the Death Dread. Now, again, similar to the Space Marine Dreadnought, an orc must be directly wired into the machine. So, again, and like the Dreadnought, it actually allows the machine to move as if it was the pilot's own body. And these things are generally armed with 2 huge pincers or saws, as in 2 big shooters, rocket launchers, scorchers, or custom mega blasters.
So, the Death Dread seem to have taken the cue of, let's armor everything. Every one of these I've seen, even though it's patchwork plating, is covered in plating. Everywhere. They also seem to have taken the cue of, this is a mech, we can put more guns on it, and have done so. Every one of these things I've seen is mounted with guns everywhere. Now, the problem I have with it is the armor is patchwork. It's quite clearly, in most cases, made of different materials, which means that the consistency of the armor is going to be non-existent. You might hit one plate that happens to be 50 millimeters thick and made of pure adamantine, and then you might hit another part of armor that's only 20 millimeters thick and made out of plain old steel. You never know. That does produce a little bit of uncertainty about where to shoot them in terms of finding a consistent weak point across the board. But I think you can safely say that that's more an inconvenience for the pilot, because the pilot doesn't know what to protect. Speaking of pilot, they've actually completely mounted the pilot in such a way that he is completely internal on these things. So that he just sees through the sensors, hence why he needs to be wired up to it. And in the orc's case, he's wired in permanently. Which I can imagine would probably drive the orc more nuts than he already is.
But at the same time, probably makes the orc, feel really important in society, because being loud, stompy, shooty,
True, and I can see this whole like orc society in terms of a law. You have like the Death Dread like circle where they have their own culture and their own way of doing things. They have grots swarming all over them to constantly repair them. I can see that as a thing where you have like the cool kids are in the Death Dreads. But it does have a particular vulnerability in that in every single model I've seen of these, their engine is completely exposed. You just have to get behind it, and you can just start putting rounds directly into the engine. And as soon as the engine goes offline, this whole thing is just a giant hunk of metal that's going to fall over. So it's really more of an intimidation weapon for the orcs, I feel, than an actual effective killing machine. Or, how should I describe this? A copycat weapon, if you will. They went, ooh, Dreadnought, that's a good idea, and then you have Death Dreads now.
Yeah. So next up, we have the Mega Dread, which is the largest orc walker short of a stomper. These things fit an enormous amount of hydraulic power into a very compact frame, which makes them far more manoeuvrable on the battlefield than larger stompers, usually armed with a combination of kill cannons, claws, and other extremely high caliber weapons. Now, these are controlled by a hybrid system of detachable surgical implants, which are often hammered into and then pried out the pilot's head during and after battle. Which suggests to me that, unlike the Death Dreads, the Mega Dread pilots can actually be removed from these before and after a battle. And they're also quite expensive, apparently, as well. Basically, warboss can expect to pay a hefty amount of teeth to acquire them.
So, Again, we've gone with the armor everything, even if it's patchwork, which, good idea. The sheer amount of hydraulic force in these indicates to me that they don't last long. You have to constantly have replacement parts because of the strain you're putting on the joints and the various pieces of metal. You're more than likely going to start breaking your own device as it basically is overloading itself in order to be moving that quickly and have that much agility on the battlefield. Its armament choices are very similar to the Imperial Knights in that, yeah, it has all of these different weapon systems it can equip, but once they are out of ammo, they are out of ammo. There's no way to actively replace them from, like when I look at the Orc kill cannon that they have mounted on it, it has 6 shots. As soon as that's out, the only thing I can see to do is to take the entire kill cannon apart in order to reload it. Or you're going to need somebody standing behind this thing or on its leg and literally taking out the spent round and shoving in a new round as the revolver rotates around. Not exactly the most practical position to be in, considering the amount of hydraulic forces in the legs. You're more than likely to be crushed against the hull. But then again, this is the orcs we're talking about. I'm pretty sure they don't mind crushing a few grots and orc boys into their armor. The next thing is the way it's described. I hate to say this. I don't think these orc pilots for these Mega Dreads have a very long life expectancy, and it's not because the Mega Dread breaks. The way these surgical implants are described is it's literally somebody taking a hammer, slamming it into your head, and then ripping it back out.
But also bear in mind, orcs as a race are very resilient. I mean, they can survive having their heads cut off and transplanted onto a whole new other body.
True. Which, I will give you credit, means I'm probably wrong on this, but it also means that I don't think any person, i.e. human or other race, could potentially operate one of these things ever.
No.
They have mounted as much DACA as almost possible onto these. I think they could mount a little, if the orcs wanted to go super all out, they could mount a little more on top of the shoulder plates. But that's if they wanted to go absolutely, completely batshit crazy with it. And let's face it, they're orcs, they probably do.
Yeah.
Dear orcs, please don't take my advice and annihilate us. But yeah, this is overall pretty. I would say this is about on the same level as the Dreadnought in terms of solidness of design. It's very well armored. It's very well armored. It's very well designed, and I hate to say it, the orcs have it down pat as far as getting together a walker. You still there?
Okay, so moving on from the orcs, just a quick question. What do you get if you take a dinosaur, make it entirely out of metal, and get a whole shit ton of weaponry? What you get are the Chaos Fiends, which come in 2 varieties, the Forge Fiend and the Mauler Fiend. Now, these things are basically mechanical animals, for lack of a better term. Demon-possessed machinery. The Forge Fiend is armed with up to 3 ectoplasma cannons or 2 Hades autocannons, and don't fire normal ammunition, for their bullets are tainted with demonic essence, and moreover they can reload and create new ammunition internally by eating nearby metal. The Mauler Fiend is strictly a melee variety of it, and can rip apart the strongest armoured targets or toughest defences with a combination of power fists, magma cutters, and lasher tendrils. These things are basically living battering rams.
Okay. So, we eliminate the need for a crew altogether because it doesn't need one. It's possessed by a demon. That means that killing it becomes even more difficult because you really have to start ripping it to pieces, as shown by a lot of the other machines that we've had with the Chaos that were basically operated by a demon, had to be completely annihilated. This thing is going to be an extreme problem to completely annihilate because it is literally covered in armor. Not only is it literally covered in armor, it is got so many different types of ways it can go with weapons, and in a size comparison is roughly 4 to 8 times the size of a Space Marine. I couldn't get a real nice size comparison with these things because I would put models next to it and then the proportions were just seemed off. But it doesn't need a supply line. It has a metric boatload of armor coming in final measurement, something like 80 millimeters on the underbelly and 40 millimeters on the top of it over what is considered basically its engine. So anywhere from 40 to 80 mil of armor, and that's really a lot for a walker. Its quadruped design means that it's very, very balanced when it comes to walking. Knocking it over is going to be a difficult prospect because when you have 4 legs instead of 2, it becomes very difficult to be knocked off balance, and they are incredibly agile. Literally, I think these things, if you could manage to command it to, could even dance a merry little jig.
Which is an amusing image.
However, even with that amusing image, I don't think I actually want to command one of these things to try to dance me a merry little jig, even if I'm its master. But then we get into the melee variant. And the melee variant, because it doesn't have a crew to operate it, means that it is in fact an animal and therefore has a more animalistic brain. It can operate melee weapons that we as people generally can't. In this case, I'm talking about the 6 tentacle prongs of Stabby Doom that are all over it, that it uses both to grab somebody like an octopus would, and then just to impale them before shoving the entire body into their maw. Some of the images I got are literally this thing snacking on Space Marines.
Oh, damn.
It goes beyond a terror weapon, because it's an effective weapon as well. You do not want to be in close combat with one of these. They're incredibly thickly armored, and on top of that, you're going to be not only fighting its 2 main forward hands, you're going to be fighting the 6 tentacles that are trying to either spear you or grab you. It's just not practical to want to fight one of these in melee. You're going to want to sit at range against the Forge or Mauler variant and pound it into dust. And when I say pound, I mean literally a formation of Lehman Russes firing everything they have into them over and over again until there's nothing left.
Yeah.
This is by far the most effective walker design we've seen. They go one step beyond the Eldar in the control system in that there's no actual crew, so knocking out the crew is not an option to destroy it, while at the same time, they go beyond anyone's expectation in that you don't need a supply line for it. It just walks around on its own. If anything, I wouldn't even call this, I wouldn't necessarily call this a machine so much I would call this a living, breathing piece of metal. I was quite surprised by just how effective these were, both in lore and in terms of like looking at them in tabletop rules and then taking apart the models and measuring them and everything. I really wanted to say, why can't I have one as like a pet outside? And then I realized, well, if you had one as a pet, it might eat the neighbors.
True.
But yeah, I don't envy anyone who has to fight one of these things at all. And I honestly am not quite sure how to actually kill it quickly. I could see like massive damage being caused and you could knock it out that way. But otherwise, this is one of the few machines that we've ever had where a critical weak point or a critical weakness is not presenting itself. You are going to have to just beat on it until it falls apart.
Okay then, so of all these walkers we looked at today, which one has been the most viable?
The two most viable ones are going to be the Fiends and the Castellans are the two most viable. The Castellan, because it's relatively small size, you could actually replace all the robotic parts with a actual person and make it a giant power suit. And it has a lot of potential if the Mechanicus are willing to upgrade it with more weapons. The Fiends, because they have no innate critical presentation of a weak point, they are terrifying in close combat, and the Forge version is absolutely terrifying at range. Plus, they are the only walkers that don't require a supply line, and they're the only walkers with 4 legs.
Yeah. Okay then. And which one was probably, would you say, was the weakest?
You're disappointing me, Imperium. I'm actually going to go with the Imperial Knight.
Really, no.
It
Mind
has
you, that being said, with it being so top heavy and with such a poor balance.
such very poor balance, and on top of that, it just doesn't. It feels like it is impractical as a weapon system. Because it's top heavy, it has no mechanism for reloading its weapons, so once the ranged weapons are out, they're just out until you can retreat back to out completely outside of the battlefield, and there's a lot of missed opportunity for it as far as a walker. If they had actually gone with the 3-leg design that the lower half suggests is possible, it would be a better walker, because then the top heavy part could be overlooked in the fact that it would still have the balance to be able to walk around and not be regularly knocked over. I also don't see any way for this thing to stand itself back up once it is knocked over. So,
Which obviously is a flaw in itself.
it's a huge flaw.
Oh.
The ones that are equipped with Power Fists and Power Claw type weapons could get themselves back up, assuming whatever they're pushing off of can support them. But I just don't see them being a very practical weapon.
Okay, so I think that covers it for this episode of Blitzkrieg. So what walkers do you think we should have covered? If we've missed any that you believe we should have covered, please write in the comments section below. This has been Runnings from 40k Theories.
And this has been Fiaura. And I guess we will see you in the final episode of all the stuff we missed.
Yes, so that'll be coming up soon, and we'll see you all again next time.